dive in and get started. Welcome to those who are joining us. Hopefully you're at home as well or in your office kitchen. You can pull up a cup of chai or coffee, since we're in Western Canada. Welcome, Dr. Stephen Nagy, a old dear friend of the Canada West Foundation, someone who's helped us immensely with our research and a go-to source for us on events on the other side of the Pacific. Sharon Sun, our trade economist, I think I called her senior trade economist in another talk we did this morning, is here with us as well. So what we're doing today is inviting you to pull up a chair, literally and figuratively, and join us in the conversation. We thought we'd share something else that we do here at Canada West. When we have friends or visitors in town from outside, they drop in and we pull up chairs, literally in the kitchen, and we'll have the entire staff of Canada West sitting around talking with our guests. So we thought we'd like to share that with the wider Canada West family, our supporters, and those who follow us. Today's conversation is a very open-ended, as the sort of gather around the kitchen table conversation is, an open-ended conversation about Western Canadian interests and the changing political, but mostly, because this is Canada West, mostly the economic and trade concerns for Western Canada around the Pacific Rim, or as Stephen likes to call it, the Indo-Pacific. And hopefully he'll be able to give us an inkling on that term. So what we'll do is we'll invite Stephen to offer some comments about what's appearing on the front. Things on the Asian, the Pacific Rim, the Indo-Pacific front, things that maybe we weren't paying too much attention to, but now that the hostages have been released and are back, we have the space and the time, or the necessity, as other things begin to emerge back on the agenda and emerge back into public attention. So we'll let Stephen give us his thoughts as to what's happening. If he were here, we'd say, so Stephen, what do you think we should be paying attention to? And then Sharon and I will have a conversation with him. We welcome questions from the audience to go to Stephen as well. But with that, Professor, Doctor, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Carlo. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Gary, for welcoming me today. And thanks to the Canadian West Foundation. I always feel like I'm at home when I visit. So it's really wonderful to be able to come and speak in this forum. I'd really like to focus on just a 5-minute commentary. And after that, I'd prefer to open up the floor to Q&A so that our audience members can engage in the dialogue that I think is really important. So the three, I guess, ideas that I'd like to really focus on is this idea of Indo-Pacific, what it means for Canadian businesses and in Western Canada, but Canada broadly. Second, the China paradox, which I think is really important for us to understand. And third, this idea of engaging in the Indo-Pacific and re-engaging in China. And I think this is a really, really important point in my discussion. So in terms of the Indo-Pacific, why are we using this term? Does it replace the Atlantic relationship? Does it replace this Asia-Pacific idea or Pacific Rim, as Carlos mentioned? No, not at all. These are complementary ideas. And when we're talking about this so-called Indo-Pacific region, what we're really focusing on is from North and South America all the way to the west side of the Indian Ocean. And we're really thinking about how to build sustainable, long-lasting, transparent, rules-based institutions in a region that's not very institutionalized. And I think that's a real key point. When we think about the Asia Pacific, we have APEC. We have many forums in which we are engaging in
APEC. You're going to have to help us out with the acronyms here.
Asia Pacific Economic Community. So this is a forum for building shared regulations, shared ideas about trade. And what we see in the Asia Pacific is that there's already many pre-existing institutions that I think are really important for shaping trade, shaping shared regulations, And that's an important way to distinguish the Indo-Pacific region and the Asia-Pacific, is that we don't really have institutions that represent the broader Indo-Pacific. So this is what I mean by institutions. And I think this is why I think Canada should be at the table. And there's a very good expression: if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think that Canada should be part of shaping the rules and regulations of the Indo-Pacific so we can promote trade and Canadian interests in the broader Indo-Pacific region. My second point was the China paradox. I think, as most of us know, Canadian and China relations are really at their lowest level in the post-normalization period. But when we look at trade, and Canada West has some really great publications about Canadian trade with China, we see that trade's up about 33% over the past 2 years. And Canada doesn't just share this China paradox. Japan, Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, the United States, despite record lows in the favorability of China, our trade footprint continues to increase. And our various chambers of commerce continue to want to be engaged in the China market. But at the same time, they want to have fair, a market that is transparent, rules-based, and really is the market driving competition rather than state-owned enterprises and protective policies. So the China paradox is my second key point, and I think we'll probably come back to this. My third point was this idea of Canada engaging in Indo-Pacific strategy that focuses on institution building and building trade partners, and re-engaging with China at the same time. And the reason why I say this is important, I think that Canada needs a broader Indo-Pacific strategy to engage and build those institutions such that we can benefit from trade. We can shape the digital economy rules. We can shape AI rules. We can shape quantum computing rules. And we can shape how agriculture and other forms of trade are engaged in the region. At the same time, I think that if we roll out an Indo-Pacific strategy, while not re-engaging China, that it will appear as a containment strategy or a geopolitical strategy. And I don't think this is in Canadian interests. As I mentioned in the China paradox comment, that Canada and Western Canada benefits from its bilateral trade relationship with China. But at the same time, we're very much interested in ensuring that trade throughout the region is rules-based and transparent and done through strong institutions that protect Canadian interests, that allow for Canadians to trade within the region and benefit from the enormous growth within the region, but at the same time, really allows us to have broader dynamic relations with like-minded countries like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and many others, which I think should be a springboard for engagement in the Indo-Pacific, taking advantage of the opportunities of the Chinese market, but also learning from their experiences of how to deal with the more challenging geopolitical and geoeconomic issues within the region. So I'll stop there. I promised 5 minutes, and I think Carlo will probably throw some questions on the table. And I really do encourage everyone to ask the questions they would like to ask.
Well, thanks for that, Stephen. And I really should ask Sharon if I can go ahead and start. That's the way things work around here. So let's start with the Indo-Pacific. You mentioned that the terms, and you and I have gone back and forth. My take on the new term coming into the table. But could you really break it down for us? If I'm a business person or an exporter, I'm used to Asia Pacific. Maybe I have a rough idea what that means. At Canada West, I use Pacific Rim to model the TPP. So you think about a rim: Chile, Peru, Mexico, Canada, maybe the US, Japan. You can actually kind of see, when I talk about the rim, you can actually kind of in your mind play out the countries. With the Indo-Pacific, I hear Indo, so I'm thinking India, and I hear Pacific, so I'm thinking Samoa or Hawaii. So help me out here with a physical description of what we're talking about.
So that's a really great way to think about it, Carlo. And if we think about when APEC, the Association of Pacific Economic Community, was founded back in the early 90s, South Asia, including Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, really wasn't on the radar in terms of trade. It wasn't on the radar in terms of a growing middle class group of citizens that could consume Canadian products, whether that's beef or milk, or we're thinking about the various grains that we have. But today, the South Asia, so India and Sri Lanka, they have a burgeoning middle class that's interested in consuming our products. Their economy is much more significant in terms of their global economic footprint. And that's really, really important. And when we're thinking about using this Indo-Pacific idea, it's a recognition that this part of the world has really come online. We have an enormous middle class that we could tap in terms of trade and in terms of thinking about how we can engage those consumers there. But also recognizing them as being an important part of the rules forming institutions moving forward. And that's really critical. We don't have strong institutions that include Southeast Asia and South Asia. And I think that we need to, again, start to chart forward the kinds of trade rules, the kinds of digital economic rules, the kind of maritime rules that we're interested in promoting amongst like-minded countries. And right now, what we're seeing is many of these trade rules and maritime rules being tested. They're being tested in terms of the geopolitics of the region. But I think that there's a real sense that the first movers in trade, digital trade, or the first movers in AI will shape the rules of the road. And with that, it's really critical to be on the front line of shaping those rules so that we're locked in rather than locked out.
I see that Bert has a question, but just before that, on this topic of Indo-Pacific versus Asia-Pacific, you mentioned the APEC as a way to, as an pre-existing institution to represent this broader region. Is this not sufficient in terms of reinforcing rules and so on for the Indo-Pacific region? As you mentioned, some of the Indo-Pacific countries are already part of the APEC.
So Sharon, that's a great question. And as I mentioned, I do think that there is a real competition within the broader Indo-Pacific region in terms of shaping rules, redefining how we understand international law, in particular in the maritime domain. And that competition really is between China and like-minded countries that I'm going to put like-minded countries into the bucket of the United States, Canada, European countries, Southeast Asian countries, New Zealand, and many others. So there's a strong sense that the current rules of the road are being challenged in the maritime domain. And the implications is that we could see a shift in controlling what we call sea lines of communication. So those are the important sea arteries that transport goods, imports and exports, and energy resources through the East China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, and the South China Sea. Now, for you as Canadians, and we do about $25.2 or $3 billion in trade through these sea lines of communication. And it doesn't sound like much, considering about $1 or $2 billion of trade across the US-Canadian border every year. But only about 6% or 5% of Canada's GDP is really related to the Indo-Pacific region. So only 5 or 6% means that's a big chunk, $25.3 billion, and that will only increase. So I think that it's important for us to look at how some of the geopolitical competition in those sea lines of communication could affect trade. My second point has to do with this idea of new institutions to develop the rules and the regulations of how we use AI, how we use cybersecurity, and what does this mean for Canadian businesses and other countries' businesses in terms of using market forces to shape competition. And I think there's a growing concern that some countries are going to create rules or regulations that favor state-owned enterprises, that favor an authoritarian system, and this could challenge or make the market an unfair place for competition and trade.
So I'll take, let me take an attempt to wind in Bert's question with the follow-up here. Canada's approach, you mentioned our lack as a country, especially federally, our lack of involvement with other institutions in the region, several of the forums that exist in Southeast Asia and across the Pacific, for example. Our approach has been to go the bilateral route. The government's current strategy is to try and engage Indonesia, try and engage India, try and engage ASEAN, which is a hybrid of the multilateral bilateral route. Is what we're talking about a break from that strategy? And how do other countries manage this? Intuitively, you think of places like New Zealand or the Aussies. They're part of the TPP. They're also part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. They're at the table. They're part of these groups. So are you suggesting that we need a break from the bilateral? If that's the case, is the current bilateral strategy a bit of a problem for this approach? And what are our competitors doing that we should think about in terms of this bilateral, multilateral, regional approach?
So I don't think it's a choice between bilateral and multilateral. I think that they are synergistic and they can work with each other. So I really don't think that we should be thinking about replacing one with the other. But I do think that there's some really good examples of how Canada can better secure its role within the region. I'm going to use Japan as an example because I think it is a really interesting country, and it's kind of promiscuous. And why I use that word is that we see it join regional trade agreements like the TPP-11, which in many ways locks out China. And we'll probably come back to this when we talk about China and Taiwan in terms of potential candidates to join the TPP-11. But at the same time, Japan is part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that includes China. So we see Japan working with China sometimes and without China. We also see Japan engage in what we call multilateral trade agreements. And some good examples of that is the Japan-EU Economic Partnership Agreement, which is a very comprehensive agreement that includes scientific exchanges, agricultural exchanges, protection of intellectual property rights. And then we see Japan also layer an infrastructure connectivity agreement with the EU, again, to try and anchor it in the region and create these strong multilateral ties. And then at the same time, we see Japan actively engaging in trilateral negotiations with South Korea and China for a trilateral FTA. So it's working in various different forms to try and secure its economic interests within the region while anchoring other governments or multilateral organizations such as the EU into the Indo-Pacific region. And I think that kind of approach is, again, working in multilateral forms, trilateral forms, bilateral forms to secure Japanese interests in the region. And Canada, I think, could learn a lot from this experience. We've joined TPP-11. My view is Canada should proactively advocate for new members to the TPP-11, including the UK, potentially Taiwan, potentially other actors, and use these multilateral forums to anchor Canada into the region, create strong trading partners, and open up markets. But importantly, be part of the rulemaking process in the region. And something significant about the TPP 11 is it focuses on intellectual property rights, it focuses on environmental law, it focuses on labor law, and limiting the role of state-owned enterprises. Why that's important? If you protect intellectual property rights, businesses will invest in research and development and the new technologies that are going to shape economies of the future. And that is really critical. And if Canada is part of that, I think that it's going to be part of shaping the rules and institutions of the future economy. And that's really critical to lock Canada's interests into the region rather than being locked out.
It's interesting from our work here, especially all the work that we did on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, modeling to make the case quantitatively with data that Canada should be a part of the agreement. That work had to be done to push back against opposition in the country for joining. There were real worries here, unfounded, I would say completely unfounded, about US retaliation. We have this internalized fear of provoking the US that's not shared in Washington or any part of the US But yet it seemed to have kept us, in this case, from pursuing what were demonstrably our interest in strengthening these ties with the Indo-Pacific. Is this something that you see, or is this a partial explanation for why we lag so far behind other countries, our competitors, our allies, in terms of engaging in the region? And if so, what can be done about this?
So I think there's two things here, Carlo, is that Canada's trade largely is centered in North America within NAFTA 2.0. And this creates a critical mass of businesses that are oriented towards North America. We also have our traditional Atlantic-centered relationship. And the Indo-Pacific, or as you call it, the Pacific Rim or the Asia-Pacific, seems to be an afterthought. It's an afterthought in terms of engagement and in terms of finding those clear opportunities within the region. So my view is that the North American trade relationship will always be the primary relationship within within Canada's sphere of influence, because of proximity, because of shared rules, because of NAFTA 2.0. And the Atlantic Center will continue to be important. But if we're thinking about 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and we're thinking about China, India, Southeast Asia, they will have burgeoning middle classes, and there'll be middle class consumers that will want to buy Canadian products. And with that, if we want to maintain a prosperous Canada, we want to slightly diversify our trading relationships so we're less sensitive to some of the shocks that do come from our southern neighbors, then investing in the region is really, really critical. And as your trade figures, as your quantitative data shows, Canada clearly benefits from engagement within the region. Now, the question for Canadians and Western Canadians is, where are those market areas that they can fill the niche? What are the networks they need to work with, and how can they do this? Fortunately, and I think this is really interesting, that we have now established what we call a joint chamber of commerce of the Indo-Pacific, where Canadian businesses throughout the region are starting to share their practices and their questions and the opportunities that exist, but also challenges. And I think that's a really good start in terms of thinking about how we can foster more collaboration through the region, through sharing best practices. I think this is a really good start for Canada. And that, yeah, for many of the people on the call today, if you're interested in this, I do encourage you to take a look at the Joint Chamber of Commerce of the Indo-Pacific that has been initiated not by government, but by businesses who see this as an important initiative to better penetrate the Indo-Pacific region and benefit from the economic opportunities there.
Turn it over to Sharon in just a sec, but we'll try and post information on that to go out with this broadcast. So some way, shape, or form, we'll stick a link or something there to information about this. So Sharon.
Well, I just thought Eddie Wong's question, just as a continuation on the discussion on institutions, I thought he had a good question. Given the trends toward regionalism and the tensions between China and the West, should such an initiative for institution building come from an Asian country or a Western country like Canada?
So thanks, Eddie. Good question. So I'm not an advocate of Canada spearheading this initiative. I'm an advocate of Canada working with partners within the region, finding out what they want from Canada, finding out what they need, and looking for shared interests within the region. My view is that building strong, transparent institutions that are based on rule of law will be critical to sustainable economic development moving forward, to promoting trade, to promoting a shared understanding of how countries should engage, not only in trade but also in the security realm. And I think that really is that should be the driving force. What we've seen is a shift over the past 5 or 6 years, where I think 6 or 7 years ago, Northeast countries like Japan and the United States were primarily thinking about security. And security does remain a critical area of interest within the region, but there's been a shift to thinking about what are the interests of Southeast Asia and South Asia. What are their priorities? And when you listen to their priorities are development, infrastructure connectivity, trade, and prosperity through an inclusive development process. And here, I think many of those interests overlap with Canada, and it provides a platform for cooperation of Canada with partners within the region to help the region develop and again create those strong institutions that can deal with the challenges in the region and promote trade and prosperity. And I think that is a shared goal of all the countries in the region and a good place to start for Canada working with partners in the broader Indo-Pacific, including China.
Do you think we have the capacity to do this? You mentioned, the inordinate amount of resources we have to spend keeping an eye and keeping tabs on the Americans. Our focus historically across the Atlantic, and the previous government, the America strategy, where I did a lot of work. Do you think we have the resources, the human capital, the capacity to do everything you suggested, or even most of what you suggested with the Indo-Pacific?
I think that Canada needs to invest in the resources and into the human capital to train young people so they have a broader understanding of the region. I guess my impression is that we've created a lot of China specialists that don't understand the rest of the region. And that's a problem because China is not the region. China is part of the region. We need to develop and continue to invest in our long-term partnerships like Japan, Korea, Singapore. These are long-standing relationships with very similar views about government, about regulation, about how institutions should develop. So we do need to invest more. The question is, where should we start? I think that it's really critical to start with like-minded partners within the region, and based on those partnerships, slowly and incrementally start to build the capacities through cooperation in bilateral and multilateral forms to secure Canadian interests within the region. Lastly, and I think really, really importantly, when we're thinking about the Indo-Pacific region, it's vast. And I think this is where we need to work more synergistically with the business community, as well as our various immigrant communities that can use their ethnic background and their familial background to engage in the region. And that's really, really critical, is to mobilize our citizens so that we can leverage their talents and their skills and their networks so that they can benefit Canada. And I think we need to do much more of that.
Yeah, two assets that I think we do leave on the table: the diaspora populations we have. So those with deep ties to the region, not just professed affinity, but affinity and knowledge that's based on interaction, that's based on agency, that's based on real connections. The other, the private sector is one of our leading groups in terms of going to these regions. So I think a couple of years back, I was just down in Lethbridge County, briefing the county commissioners who were on a trip getting ready to head off to a trip to China and Japan. So one of the things I think we don't do is share that knowledge. The other issue we have is, I had to write an op-ed in the Lethbridge Herald defending the county commissioners for going off to one of their biggest markets, a market that had made 4 or 5 visits to Lethbridge, but for which Lethbridge hadn't returned the favor. So we have this asset, but we keep tripping over ourselves in the expenditure of resources to follow trade, which is hugely important. The numbers bear out how important it is. That's always been an issue, and that's something I don't think we've ever really come to terms with. Before turning it back to Sharon, I would also just note on China, I'm glad you think we've got that generation of sinologists, those who study China, coming along. I still see just huge gaps. We talk about the 5-year plan here, and outside of Finance Canada and Foreign Affairs, most Canadians know that it's a plan and that it's 5 years. For our second largest trading partner, 13% of agricultural trade, that sort of gap that we have is just, it's as scary as anything that we see coming out of China. Our lack of knowledge, our lack of ability to understand what's happening. China, the whole region is just really, really frightening.
Well, as someone that lives in the region, and I was just in Ottawa last week speaking to various interest groups. I do think that policymakers get it, but yes, there is not enough expertise that understands the region, and I think that needs to be bolstered. We need stronger programs. We need people that understand the languages in the region. We need people that understand the cultures. And again, as I mentioned, I don't think it's enough to be a single country. So for myself, I don't just focus on Japan, although I live in Japan. I focus on the region and the interactions between the region. And I think that gives me a kind of insight into, again, as I mentioned, the China paradox. From afar, I think people look at Japan's initiatives in the region and they see a harder line against China, or perhaps a more engaged policy towards Taiwan. But when you drill into the data and you start to think about the trade relationship and you speak to people in the region, it's different. The Japanese are not taking this zero-sum approach to China. They're engaging where they can, and they're building other relationships where they think is necessary to pull China in a different direction. And I think that we need more regional specialists that understand the region in general. I don't think we have enough, Carlo. So if I gave that impression, I apologize. I think we need much more talent that understands the region. And I really think it's important to start from our traditional, long-standing, like-minded partners.
So I think I'm going to turn it over to Sharon next. I think we just got David Hill's question there with what can agriculture do? Sharing the experience when visits are made. I shouldn't be the one writing the piece in the Lethbridge Herald. It should be the groups that have gone to share the information and to talk about it when they come back. Yeah, we'll turn it over back over to Sharon. She had a thought here.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say thanks to Stephen for really emphasizing Japan's role in terms of this interplay between politics and trade and also policy in the region. I think that's really important and not really thought of often or enough here in Western Canada or even in Canada. I think Zanbaz had a really good question who said, unlike Japanese, which doesn't follow the zero-sum game, is the Canadian interest lined with the US interest exclusively in South Asia and Southeast Asia? There is an apprehension in countries of South Asia and Southeast Asia that Canada won't invest, or even if it invests, it would be heavily influenced by US policy in respect of China.
So Yambaz, that's a great question. And I think I've argued this in many of my writing publicly and privately, is that Canada needs its own brand. It needs to be seen as an honest stakeholder within the region that will disagree with its US partner on a principled way when they feel it's necessary. But I think at the same time, we should be realistic that Canada and the United States share many values, many interests, and we will likely be aligned many of the days of the week because of that shared background and shared trade interests within the region. For Canada, engaging with Southeast Asia and South Asia, the criticism I usually hear is it's not sustained, it's not serious, and we really don't know, Southeast and Southeast Asians feel that Canada is not, it's not taking the region seriously. And with that, I think Canada does have a long ways to go to build a better presence. And one way to do that, again, is to set up a permanent presence within the region, a trade office that's specifically focusing on trade in Southeast Asia. It could be setting up a permanent presence in terms of an institution that focuses on health or infrastructure and connectivity, but it's about that sustained engagement with stakeholders within the region and showing face and finding out what are the needs and interests of partners within the region and what they want of Canada. And I think that is really, really critical. And as I mentioned, I think that it's really critical that Canada does build its own brand, a principle-based brand that does sit apart from the United States, but also is also true to the reality that Canada and the United States share many, many interests in the region. Super question.
Yeah, I'd like that one as well. So just very quickly to follow up on that, this issue about building capacity is something with which we've struggled. When those of us in think tanks and research institutions talk about building capacity, when Sharon and I go to Parliament and raise this point, you get the eye rolls. It's pinheads asking for more money for more pinheads to run around and write papers. So I think as a self-criticism for us, we really have to do a better job of making the case as to why this is important. I would argue that's because we haven't succeeded. We haven't gotten through. So that's a criticism directed, back at us and our failure. We've been aware of this, but we just haven't been able to make the case in a way that really moves people to think about it, to get the resources that we need, resources that are focused on interest, as a national interest, as opposed to academic interest. I would argue is a key change that we can start to make when we talk about this. But let's go on to other questions.
Yeah, so Michael Goldberg just sent a question asking briefly, how do we leverage the regional diasporas in Canada, their ties back to the Indo-Pacific, and the numerous business associations built around these diasporas and their business interests, ties, and opportunities?
So Michael, that's a great question. And I think that this is a bit of a double-edged sword. I think for many of our, let's say, ethnic Hungarian communities or ethnic Chinese communities or ethnic Korean communities, they may not want to actually be that bridge to wherever their national heritage comes from, because of political differences, because of some of the challenges with some of the countries within the region. There's inherent risk in doing that. So I think that we need to be sensitive to those challenges. But at the same time, I think that if an ethnic community does form a chamber of commerce, for example, of, let's say, in Calgary that focuses on trade, let's say in Southeast Asia, then we need to find opportunities to share and promote and support that initiative. So I think we have to be sensitive to the politics that can create real pressure on our ethnic communities. But at the same time, if it's an organic organization where, let's say, Southeast Asians come together to promote more Canada presence in Southeast Asia, then we should find ways to help them. And it could be providing a bit of research through think tanks like Canada West Foundation, looking at Canada's trade footprint in Southeast Asia. What can we do better? What can we do? What do we need to improve? It could be public forums to provide more insight in terms of what are the opportunities in the region, or events like this where somebody that understands the region quite well comes and speaks to business leaders or to the different ethnic communities in our country of what they could be doing to secure economic opportunity within the region.
Yeah, that is a great question. It's also one that requires a podcast of its own. We did quite a bit of work on this issue, how to work with diaspora populations for development and trade, back when I was with the U.S. government. And the discussions and the experience, obviously the U.S. political environment and the immigration environment's a bit different, but the issues that Stephen outlined were front of mind with us as we were working through these issues. The conditions of exit determine diaspora views in their new country, and those conditions of exit, how they left the country, good terms, bad terms, can really shape their approach to their country of origin. And those conditions of exit don't always line up with national interest in the new country. So on the political side, there's much attention and caution that needs to be exercised. But economically, and especially for international development, we found great allies in terms of making development investments in these communities, in terms of improving the conditions of entry for people into the US by working with diaspora populations. So when we think about trade in a place like Hong Kong, say, where you're looking to attract people that are leaving, the diaspora population in country can play a huge role in making you more competitive for attracting talent. So it's really useful to think about the opportunities in specificity. Look at specific opportunities. A blanket policy that takes consideration of the political and economic, yes, but conditions change diaspora group to diaspora group, even within diaspora groups, and they change about the specifics of what's being discussed. But that is a whole nother level of investment in terms of developing capacity to think about this. That we've done some of that in Canada, but that's an area where, again, more research and more investment is needed to develop the capacity to manage it with sophistication, with nuance, and with caution. So
I noticed that there are some questions as well in the question and answer box that we've received, still concerning, the more macro institutional level. So Chen Yi Wang asked, you mentioned that transparency is very important for building robust international trade system. Do you think China would be willing to adapt itself to these rules or try to model the world with its own rules, given its heavy weight in international trade? I think that's a really good question, because that's something that I've been discussing over the last 2 weeks since the WTO's trade policy review on China. But I'll let you answer it first, Stephen.
So I think if you want to know what China thinks, you should read what Chinese authors are writing. And there's quite a prominent scholar that I recommend you Google up, Yang Shui Tong. And maybe Sharon, you can just put that name in the text box from Tsinghua University. And he's pretty explicit. He says, China will work hard to weaken the influence of the United States and Western institutions so that they better reflect the needs and the interests of the Chinese government. He's written it quite explicitly. We have other prominent scholars that also write about this. And I think the Chinese government also is very clear about this, is that they feel that current international institutions favor Western concepts of governance, over focus on transparency and rule of law, and potentially questions about sovereignty and non-interference. And the current government in China would very much like to weaken all of these initiatives. And I think that also includes in the trade environment. So I think you should ask Chinese scholars about this and Chinese policy makers about this. And I think they've been unequivocally clear. I think that when we look at examples such as the BRI and the export of the digital economy to BRI recipients, that's the Belt Road Initiative, we see that the Chinese government is also exporting its standards in terms of how to negotiate and use the digital economy. And I think that is really, really important for you to be thinking about. It means that these countries are being locked into Chinese standards that really focus on sovereignty, non-interference, less transparent approach to bilateral relations, non-binding approaches to bilateral relations. And I think ultimately this creates challenges in terms of sustained, rules-based, transparent, good governance that really provides the real foundation for long-term sustained growth.
So we'll get to Dave, and we'll put you in touch with Dave and Wally directly. We've got a couple good friends of Canada West set of questions. I wanted to turn back to your conundrum of China and thinking about your approach to allies, and working within like-minded countries in the region. There's another contradiction or conundrum. Our allies also tend to be our competitors. So when we can cooperate with folks like with the Americans, we will cooperate with the Americans on security matters. We will cooperate with the Americans on intelligence matters. We will cooperate with the Americans on political matters. But when it comes to economics and trade, we often find ourselves in competition with the Americans, the Australians, the Americans, as we famously talk about with the NAFTA renegotiation, told us, don't you dare talk to China. Meanwhile, what were they doing? Talking to China to sign an agreement behind our back that basically stabbed Canadian farmers in the back and put a hand in Canadian farmers' wallets. So we find that even with our allies, we face this economic competition. How do we manage this? I'm writing a book chapter on this one that you're going to read and critique. Share some thoughts, because you and I go back and forth about this, but some of your thoughts. Our interests do not always line up with our political allies' interests. Our political allies, especially the Americans, will run through us in a New York second if there's money on the table. If we do extradition favors or other things for the Americans, it's not going to show up in economic considerations if there's money on the table. So how do we manage this tension?
So, Carlo, that's a great question. And in most of my writings, I write a lot about middle powers and middle powers such as Canada and the need to, of course, shape China's behavior in a more positive direction, but also shape the United States behavior in a more positive direction. And the previous administration was a challenging one in terms of not only optics, but the style that engaged in renegotiation activities. And I think the NAFTA 2.0 agreement was very much an example of that, I guess, coercive behavior that we experience from our ally. So I think that it's really critical that Canada works with middle powers to try and shape the behavior of our allies like the United States, so that we don't fall victim to the kind of coercion that I think that we saw in the previous administration. And I think that is really a big take home. And often when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, we think about it in terms of the United States and China shaping the region. But in reality, I think that it will be a collection of middle powers that are going to come together to influence both China and the United States in terms of how their competition and the choices that they're making are not really in line with long-term allies or stakeholders in the region. And from this point of view, I think that, of course, Canada will have to work with the United States. It will continue to be challenged by that relationship in some areas. But as long as it's market forces driving the interaction, I think that Canada or Australia or other countries will be able to manage that. But if it's the state per se that's shaping the rules of the road, I think this is much more problematic for Canadian interests and the interests of other middle powers. And I think that what we saw in the previous administration, it wasn't market forces that were driving the NAFTA 2.0, it was a political process. And I think growing challenges emerging from China is not market forces driving the problems in the economic relationship, but politics. And it's something interesting. And I see Sharon with her hand up. Sharon?
Yeah, just on that note, given what you just said, would reinforcing the WTO not be more beneficial in terms of, as a middle power stance on addressing some of the issues, whether it is transparency or IP or digitization or otherwise?
My sense is that the WTO is not going to be able to deal with these challenges. There's too many stakeholders that have too much to say, and what will eventually happen is the lowest common denominator will be the basis for any kind of reform in the WTO. My sense is there's a collection of like-minded countries that would like to either reform the WTO entirely or use templates such as the TPP 11 or TPP 2.0 as a new template for how we think about trade, how we think about IPR, how we think about environmental law, labor law, and the role of state-owned enterprises, amongst a whole other group of chapters. I think that that is the direction. Yeah, I don't have a very optimistic view about the future of the WTO because of the enormous challenges I think it's facing.
Although, but that being said, my concern is I would see a proliferation of these regionalism or regional institutions, and then that creates conflicts as well within each other, and within this like spaghetti bowl effect of institutions.
So I'm going to stand by my point. I think that the competition moving forward is going to push both the United States and China to move away from, I think, large multilateral trade agreements that limit the choices they have in terms of their bilateral competition. And this is going to create enormous pressures on Canada, Australia, and other middle powers or smaller countries. And I think the outcome will likely be some kind of renegotiated smaller version of the TPP that creates a critical mass of countries that moves forward and really creates that kind of critical mass of like-minded countries that feel that the trade rules that exist between them are market-oriented and meet their national interests.
So this kind of, we're getting close to the end. I'm going to let Sharon ponder the last question to bring to Stephen after this one. It seems that we are, your prediction for middle powers to band together to try and constrain or direct or nudge the action of the two global economic hegemons appears to be happening with the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Agreement, one could argue. It's had many purposes in its long history from Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand. But one was the thought with the Obama administration that this could contain China. But when Donald Trump came along, the idea suddenly emerged, well, maybe it's more important to contain the Trump administration, to have a group of countries that would have a set of rules that could give some counter to the power of the Trump administration. So with the prospect, with Donald Trump not having gone away, and my recent trip to Washington convinced me that his return is very much on the table, and with China asking to join the TPP, does your idea for these agreements to nuance or change the behavior of these larger powers suddenly start to bear out on the ground? If China were to join the TPP and join by accepting most of the conditions in a way that supported what's there, would this be one step toward what you're talking about? And would this be good for Canada?
Lots to unpack there. So my view is what we'll likely see is Japan and other countries will pull out the negotiations for both Taiwan and China to join the TPP as long as possible. And this may be used as pressure to pull back the United States to the TPP 11, or to encourage the United States to lead a TPP 2.0 that has middle class, the middle class as one of its key components. I think many of the current TPP members would welcome that because I think that their fundamental interest is to anchor the United States within the region. And they would like to anchor the United States through trade, through building shared norms about how trade should be, and through trade formation. Whether Japan and other countries will do that, that's a really interesting question, but I foresee this as being the way forward. And I do think countries like Canada would probably welcome that kind of initiative, because again, the purpose is to get the United States into the region, to be part of the trading environment. And it's interesting, the United States is not part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It's not part of the TPP 11. And if a trilateral free trade agreement went with China, South Korea, and Japan, that would be the third huge trade agreement that the United States is not part of. And I'm not even counting the Japan EU EPA. These are significant downward pressures on the US economy. And I think there's enormous value in the United States being part of the region in terms of trade. But that goes back to one of your points today, is the data says trade is good. The data says Canada should be in the region. And I would say the data says the United States should be part of the region. There's a lot of opportunity there, but the public's not there. They misunderstand the region. They don't understand the importance of trade within the region. And I think that is a place where we need to speak more loudly and be part of the process of informing the public of why trade is important, the benefits of trade in the region, and how does that trade really percolate down to the agricultural community, the beef, poultry, and pork community, our community that exports natural resources. We need to be much more loud and informed and convincing to ensure that our publics understand the importance of trade.
Yeah, this is largely in the current environment a thankless task. We've had the rise of what I've termed neo-McCarthyism, referring to the McCarthy hearings and the Red Scare in the U.S. We've had a rise of that in Canada. There are obvious threats, but over-responding or misunderstanding the threats poses as great a danger to us as the threats themselves. McCarthyism was a huge damage to the U.S., to its reputation, to its ability to respond to the rise of communism. Misunderstanding the threats, mischaracterizing them for short-term political gain is just as dangerous. So, yeah, it's a job that's not without. This as well. Even over in Japan, it's a tough position to be making these arguments based on data, based on reason in the current political environment, especially as it bleeds over from the US.
Well, I'm glad we've had almost 100 people on the call today listening to these kinds of ideas, and hopefully they go back and they share those Halloween treats with their family members and share some of the ideas, and it will spread. But again, I think more rational discussions with people that are interested in these issues is really critical to building more literate Indo-Pacific stakeholders, and that includes Indo-Pacific stakeholders from Western Canada and in the Canada West Foundation.
Thanks. So let's give the next generation of great trade economists and great thinkers on trade the final question, the final thought for the day.
Well, actually, I was going to say we still have quite a few questions, big questions, from climate change policy impact of trade to that region to, what does the post-COVID environment look like for Canadian trade with the region? But I think given the time, we would be happy to, email these questions to you, Stephen. And
I have 10 more minutes if you'd like.
Oh, okay. So, well, I don't know which one you would like to choose. The climate change.
You're the boss, Sharon.
Sure. Well, I think the climate change question is, a really big elephant in the room. So we should definitely at least talk a little bit about that. So a question from Brittany Hunter: what impact do you think the climate change policy will have on trading with this region?
Thanks, Brittany. So I think when we're speaking about climate change, I think we should be, I don't know how many of you on the call understand or know that China, Japan, and Korea, the biggest economies within the region, have committed to a zero carbon future by 2050 and 2060. They're investing heavily in renewables, solar, wind, biomatter, and nuclear. And I think that this is a real sign that the future going forward in terms of climate change is about really changing our energy profile. And these countries are leading it. And, because I spend so much time in the region, places like China have substantially improved their environmental footprint, and you can notice it. So when we're thinking about climate change and we're thinking about opportunities for Canada, I think that we need to be thinking about how climate change is going to positively and negatively impact the region. In terms of positive impact. We might see northern parts of China become a little bit more hospitable in terms of agriculture. But the reality, the hotter it gets, it's going to be more severe water shortages and problems in terms of producing the huge amounts of food that will be necessary to manage a population of 1.4 billion people. In that sense, I think that Canada will have a huge role in terms of dealing with some of the food security challenges that China faces. And it's really critical that Canadian agricultural leaders are already building those relationships, creating those pipelines where that they can eventually provide for the needs of a country that will be challenged in terms of food security. Southeast Asia and South Asia similarly will be affected negatively by climate change. I don't think it can be prevented. And that means that they're also going to have food security challenges. And it will be Canada and the United States that largely fills the gap in terms of the food security challenges moving forward. So this is bad news for that region, but it's an opportunity for Canada and I think the United States in terms of thinking about where the future markets lie, not just because of the enormous amount of middle class consumers that are going to emerge, but thinking about how climate change is really going to create food security challenges for these regions, and that they're going to need steady and sustainable suppliers. And I think Canada can fill that role.
Yeah, and I also want to add, given the recent events from, increasingly high coal prices and other energy prices, it really emphasizes the increasing challenge in the region in terms of looking for substitutes in order to also meet the goals that these individual countries have indicated in Paris in COP. But at the same time, be able to continue its economic growth and facilitate this economic growth. So that's an increasingly challenging problem in the region, in China, as well as the Indo-Pacific region. And I think Canada does have a role to play in that. Carlo, back to you.
I was going to let you continue with the questions and take it out from here.
No, I think that's about it. The only other question that I see is
we have Dave and Wally. We can actually bring them in rather than just emailing them off to the side.
Yeah, so David earlier asked the question, what role should various sectors such as agriculture, food, and nutrition play in developing these new relationships? Was that the one? Oh,
Yep.
No, wait, I think that was answered. There was a question about COVID.
And supply chains.
Yeah, let me just, oh yes. What discussion of repatriating supply chain post-COVID, does what we trade look different in the future? Is that of concern to the Asia Pacific region?
So thanks, David. That's a really important question. And when Carlo and Sharon and I were kind of thinking about the theme of this discussion, we were going to talk about selective or a selective diversification of supply chains. And what that really means is that I think on sensitive technologies that we're going to see firewalls being built in terms of sensitive technologies that really are associated with semiconductors and dual use products. I think increasingly we're going to see supply chains try to deal with some of the resilience challenges that we've had in the region. Just let me illustrate. So when the COVID-19 pandemic started in Wuhan, what we saw, the Chinese government shut down that whole region. And that whole region really is a center of manufacturing for cars and for pharmaceutical products. And the lesson was, and of course, it created challenges in terms of the supply chains for these products globally. And I think the lesson from that is that within China, it's really important to start to diversify supply chains and to make them more resilient in the case that there's another shutdown in parts of the Chinese supply chain. But there's also this understanding that supply chains need to diversify throughout the region to create more resilience and more alternatives to deal with black swan events such as the COVID-19 pandemic, natural disasters such as the March 2011 tsunami and earthquake in Japan, and that by creating more resilience and selectively diversifying, that we can ensure that supply chains remain open and they remain sustainable and relatively steady. And I think that is the broader trend that we're seeing right now. So it's partly driven by cost, it's partly driven by geopolitics, and it's partly driven by the reality that another COVID pandemic will happen, another transnational issue will happen, another a natural disaster will happen that will disrupt supply chains. And it's really critical that we create a whole bunch of alternatives. So this is not a decoupling argument. I think decoupling is not possible. Rather, it's selectively trying to diversify on sensitive technologies, but also creating resilience throughout the system.
So, the decoupling argument, shows up in a couple places, especially with supply and production chains. One of the more insidious threats we face is, China is the largest economy, supply and production chains, its dominant market position in key industrial inputs, in manufacturing inputs, and increasingly in digital inputs. We may not want to decouple, but when the Americans come along and tell us to decouple, we could very easily wind up in the spot where the Americans don't have the same exposure to these supply chains because of the size of their economy that we do. And we find ourselves back in the 1950s when the Americans were coming after us to try and decouple, not to sell grain to China. They were coming after firms, US subsidiary firms in Canada. They were coming after Canadian firms that were trading in third-party countries. So, thinking about this going forward, that's something we're trying to wrap our minds around here. The exposure to extraterritorial measures that the Americans enact in their economic conflict with China and their attempt to move those US economic measures to third parties. And given our integration with the US and our increasing integration with Chinese supply and production chains, we could find ourselves drawn up short. And this is Huawei, not with 5G, but Huawei with 4G. And the needs that we have, First Nations communities, 60% of whom aren't wired to adequate measure in this country, who don't have the access, and for whom a company like Huawei that produces 4G technology that's appropriate for remote and difficult installations, a company that makes its money in Africa, not in easy markets, may be an important consideration here. So going forward, those supply and production chains face, I think, a more insidious threat, and that's the exportation of the American economic conflict with China through extraterritorial measures. And we've seen this in the 1950s with Diefenbaker. We've seen this in the 80s with Cuba and Helms-Burton. And we've seen it more recently from the Americans as well. Just a thought.
Yeah, and I would agree with the concerns about this in certain supply chains that are really sensitive in terms of the geopolitical competition between the two countries. But I'll just, we're all online today, and I would wager that most of us bought things to work from home over the past year and a half, whether it's a chair or a new computer or a new monitor. And I think if you look at the label, most of that stuff came from China. And my point is that our trade relationship is robust. We consume many products that are produced in that part of the world. And if the United States was to somehow think about decoupling, that they would have to replace all of those products that are made extremely cheaply and they can be consumed in the United States. And the challenge there is that we don't see the United States really fundamentally changing its economy so that people can afford more expensive things that are made at home or even made across the border in Canada. And until that equation changes, I think that the supply chains that are primarily in China will continue to supply the consumer goods for the middle classes in North America, in Europe, in Japan, and many other parts of the world.
The only positive to this is that we can identify areas where we are vulnerable, things for which the Americans are not concerned about with their trade with China, but which we are, because we don't have the size and the breadth of the American economy.
Yeah.
So we can, in the future, start to identify those areas where we may get blindsided by the Americans asking us to do something that's in their interest, that they can afford, but is a bit, but the same calculation doesn't apply to us. And that's where I think we've got to learn the lessons from history, from the 1950s and earlier, in terms of starting to think proactively about that and define our interest in advance of the Americans defining our interest for us. As you mentioned, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So we certainly need to be in the table in that discussion.
Absolutely. That requires people to understand the region, understand the trends, and can have a voice in the policy discussions here in Canada.
So we're already 13 minutes over, but quickly, tell us what you're up to, what we should be looking for in our inboxes or your next research line publications, so that people who want to follow you know what to look for.
All right. Well, I just finished a six-part policy brief with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute about Canada's engagement in the Indo-Pacific, focusing on trade, the digital economy, the maritime environment, and a few other themes, which you can access at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm just finishing a book on Chinese perceptions of Japanese foreign policy under Prime Minister Abe, which basically contrasts and compares how they understood the former Prime Minister's policies when he was working with Mr. Obama and his policies when he was working with Mr. Trump. And I guess the take home is that the Chinese are very adept at reading the power changes in Tokyo, and that they're really not wedded to any particular view about Japan. They're wedded to their national interests. Lastly, I think, I'm just finishing up a couple books on, or a couple articles on middle powers and how they can be proactive stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific in terms of shaping institutions and pushing the behavior of the great powers in more positive directions.
Yeah, that's why we love you so much. One of many reasons. That's a really impressive research agenda, and we look forward to sharing it with you in the future. I'm just going to prepare an invoice to send off to Brian Lee Crowley for that plug for Macdonald-Laurier. He's going to see how much I can hit him up for that. With that, Sharon, anything to take us out?
No, I'm good. I think you should close up now because we are running quite late into the time.
There you go. We still have 65 people on, which is a real sign for interest in this topic. Stephen, it's always a pleasure to have you out for dinner when you're back home here in Calgary. And it's even better seeing you in Japan, where you've got the in on some of the best places to go out and get sushi. I look forward to doing that in the future again as well.
Thanks to Canada West Foundation, Carlo, Sharon, and your team for an amazing event, and all the people on the call that ask great questions. I learned as much from all of you as hopefully you learned from today's discussion. So thanks.
Thanks. And for those listening, tomorrow, Gary Marr, our CEO, is going to be talking with the new Consul General for the UK here in the prairies. So if you have a chance, tune in for that. Otherwise, from Canada West, we'll have our infrastructure paper out, how to reform Canada's trade infrastructure. That's been several years in the making, and that will be out soon. And Sharon and I are just wrapping up our early analysis of China's 5-year plan and how we should start formulating our ability to understand that, and over the long term, be able to work with it and use the information in it. That'll be coming out very shortly. So Stephen, again, always a pleasure to see you. Sharon, thanks for joining.
Tokyo or Beijing or Calgary or wherever we see each other next.
Yeah.
Look forward to it.
Sounds
And
good.
dinner. Okay, guys, bye-bye. And to
Thank you,
everyone
Ed.
joining us,
Talk to you
thank you
soon.
for joining.